Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Friday, December 1st, 2023. The House of Representatives votes to expel Congressman George Santos, Republican from New York, 311 to 114, with 2 voting present. It's only the 6th time in U.S. history that a House member has been expelled. Supporters of expulsion say that Congressman Santos lied extensively about his biography and resume and faces federal charges of fraud and illegal use of campaign contributions. Opponents say the congressman has not been convicted of any crime in a court of law. The humanitarian pauses in fighting between Israel and Hamas has ended, along with the exchange of hostages held in Gaza for Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. We'll hear from Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who just finished up a trip to Israel, about the resumption of the war. The Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell talks about the economy, inflation, and interest rates at Spellman College in Atlanta. The U.S. House votes to overturn a regulation from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that requires financial institutions to collect certain data on applications for credit for women-owned, minority-owned, and small businesses. The Senate has also voted to reverse this rule, but President Biden says he'll veto it. Former Supreme Court Justice Sandra O'Connor has died. We'll talk about her legacy with Zach Schoenfeld, courts and legal reporter with The Hill. And we'll also talk with him about a Supreme Court case argued this week, dealing with whether federal agencies can use their own judges to issue fines for violations of law. And President Biden and First Lady Jill Biden light the national Christmas tree. A story from Fox News. The House of Representatives voted to expel scandal-plagued Congressman George Santos on Friday, making him the first House lawmaker to be expelled in more than 20 years. A solemn hush fell over the House chamber as Speaker Johnson slammed his gavel, formalizing the historic ouster. Santos walked out of the House chamber just before all the votes that sealed his fate were cast and did not answer reporters' questions on the way out. The last time a House lawmaker was expelled was more than 2 decades ago, when the late Congressman Jim Traficant, Democrat from Ohio, was voted out of Congress in 2002. Prior to his ousting, Traficant had been convicted of 10 felony counts, including racketeering and taking bribes. Santos has not been convicted of a crime, but he's been indicted on 23 counts related to wire fraud, identity theft, falsifications of records, credit card fraud, and other charges. He's been accused of using campaign funds on a number of luxury goods and treatments such as Botox. He has pleaded not guilty. That reporting from Fox News. Here is House Speaker Mike Johnson, Republican from Louisiana, announcing the result of the vote.
On this vote, the yeas are 311, the nays are 114, with 2 recorded as present. 2/3 voting in the affirmative, the resolution is adopted, and a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. The clerk will notify the governor of the state of New York of the action of the House. Under Clause 5D of Rule 20, the chair announces to the House that in light of the expulsion of the gentleman from New York, Mr. Santos, the whole number of the House is now 434.
House Speaker Mike Johnson presiding. The vote in the House was more than the 2/3 required by the Constitution for an expulsion of a member. Broken down by party, the vote to expel 206 Democrats and 105 Republicans, and voting not to expel 112 Republicans and 2 Democrats, Bobby Scott of Virginia and Nikema Williams of Georgia. 2 members voted present, both Democrats, Jonathan Jackson of Illinois and Al Green of Texas, and 8 members did not vote. Now, former Congressman Santos did not speak to reporters as he walked out of the chamber, down the Capitol steps, and into a waiting car.
Don't block his way!
What do you have to say to your constituents?
Do you have anything to say to your constituents, George Santos?
Mr. Santos?
What is wrong with you people? What is wrong with you
We're
people?
reporters, my friend.
Yeah.
Mr. Santos, what do you have to say to your constituents?
Mr. Santos, any comment?
Do you regret having
Back
been
on
found
that.
out?
You need to pull
Mr.
out.
Santos?
Move.
Guys, move away from the vehicle. Let's go.
Oh, don't go behind me. Come on.
The scene as Congressman Santos got into a car and drove off after being voted out, expelled from the House. Other members of Congress did stop to speak with reporters on the steps of the Capitol, including Nicole Maliotakis, Republican from New York, who voted yes on expulsion.
Just to keep somebody here who's a stain on the institution and did these wrong things just because we wanted that extra vote, that's not the right thing. I mean, we need to vote our conscience and for what our constituents, but also it was just a matter of right and wrong in this situation, and it was the right thing to remove somebody who did a lot of wrong things.
How will the vetting process be different, do you think, next time around?
How's the what?
How will the vetting process be different?
Well, that's
next time
certainly
around?
something that we've expressed with these county organizations and the state parties. I mean, I think it's true. We need to treat this like a real job interview, and the parties need to do background checks and their due diligence before they put their name behind a candidate and make others vulnerable when they endorse them.
So it's frustrating that leadership did vote to keep him in when you're talking about it being an issue of right and wrong.
Yeah. Look, the speaker made it very clear to the members that they were not whipping this vote. It was vote your conscience and your constituents. My conscience told me that George Santos has to go, and I believe my constituents believe the same thing.
What do you say to those members who are saying it's an issue of precedent setting? I know you might have answered this already, but we just got over here. Sorry.
I think George Santos set his own precedent by what he did. I mean, that the reality is I think you need to differentiate what the Ethics Committee was able to produce and what, I'm sorry, because I'm going to catch a train. We need to differentiate what the Ethics Committee was able to produce as it relates to expelling him, which was very warranted, versus the criminal charges, which he will have his day in court on whether he goes to jail or not. I mean, those are two separate things. We saw enough to warrant expelling him, and I think this is a good day for his constituents who will now have an opportunity to elect someone new who is not a fraud.
Congresswoman Nicole Maliotakis, Republican from New York, speaking to reporters outside the U.S. Capitol building. You heard a question there about the leadership of the House Republicans all voting not to expel. All four voted not to expel. Speaker Mike Johnson, Majority Leader Steve Scalise, Conference Chair Lee Stefanik, and the Majority Whip, Tom Emmer. Congressman Dan Goldman, Democrat from New York, was one of the Democratic leaders in the effort to expel Congressman Santos. He also spoke to reporters after the vote.
It's a shame that it has taken 11 months. It's a shame there were 115 votes to protect George Santos, including all of the Republican leadership. Lee Stefanik in New York was George Santos's biggest endorser and biggest supporter, and she still is wrapping herself around George Santos. But the resolution passed, and I think that today, at least, democracy prevailed.
Are you optimistic?
You're from New York, and you represent New York, just like Congressman Santos. Your take on what you just saw happen today?
Well, my take is that New York has been broadly, beyond just the District 3, has been clamoring for George Santos to be removed from Congress since January. We had members of New York 3 come down this morning and talk about how they thought that he would be removed in January because his conduct was so obvious and so egregious to defraud the voters of the 3rd District of New York. But all of the New York Party supported George Santos, Republican Party. They all wrapped their arms around him. There's a lot of interlocking connections between the Republican members in New York and George Santos. And they tried to protect him for as long as they could to preserve their political power and their slim majority, and also potentially to save themselves from further discredit.
Congressman Dan Goldman, Democrat from New York, with reporters outside the Capitol building. This story from NBC News, just ahead of the vote to expel George Santos from Congress. A fellow Republican congressman accused Santos of personally defrauding him and his mother. In a letter sent to colleagues, which was obtained by NBC News, Congressman Max Miller, Republican of Ohio, said he learned earlier this year that Santos's campaign had charged my personal credit card and the personal card of my mother for contribution amounts that exceeded FEC limits. Neither my mother nor I approved these charges or were aware of them. Miller said that as a result, he has spent tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees dealing with the situation. He went on to say that he has seen a list of 400 people, including other Republican House members he believes were also overcharged by Santos. That was from NBC News. As mentioned, 112 House Republicans, a little over half the total in the House, voted not to expel George Santos, including the top 4 Republican leaders. Also voting not to expel, Congresswoman Maria Elvira Salazar of Florida. She spoke to reporters right before the vote.
Are you going to vote to expel Santos?
No, I'm not.
Why?
Because I'm no one to expel anyone. I respect the American electoral system. I represent the city of Miami. the Cuban exiles. We know that this is the best system on earth. I know that the charges against him are despicable, but who am I to say out? The constituents are the ones who are going to kick him out in November or not. And something interesting that I think we should point out is that the Ethics Committee did not recommend to expel him. So it's up to us. My conscience says that I'm no one to expel anyone from Congress.
Do you think there are a bunch of people that are on the same page as you?
We don't know. I've been asking my staff, and no one really knows. But I know that and I'm not saying that I'm defending him, but the only people who can get him out is either a judge or a jury, according to the American judicial system.
Congresswoman Maria Elvira Salazar, Republican from Florida, with reporters right before the vote to expel Congressman George Santos, and that vote was successful. He is no longer a member of Congress. And with that vacancy, there are now 434 voting members in the House, 221 Republicans, 213 Democrats. New York Governor Kathy Hochul, a Democrat, posting, "I am prepared to undertake the solemn responsibility of filling the vacancy in New York's 3rd District. The people of Long Island deserve nothing less." Under New York law, she has up to 10 days to call for a special election for the open seat, and the election day must be within 70 to 80 days from that point. This is Washington Today. And now to the war between Israel and Hamas, which has restarted after a week pause that allowed hostages in Gaza to be exchanged for Palestinian prisoners held in Israel, and also humanitarian aid to flow into Gaza. Al Jazeera News reporting dozens of Palestinians have been killed since Israel resumed attacks on Gaza after the expiration of the truce, according to health officials there. And Israeli army has dropped leaflets telling people in parts of already bombarded and densely populated southern Gaza to evacuate to nearby areas, signaling an expanding offensive. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken just ended a trip in Israel. He spoke with reporters at the airport in Dubai.
What are the prospects for renewed pauses and for continued releases of hostages after what we saw today? And also, what does the resumption of hostilities mean for this pursuit of a post-Hamas structure in Gaza? On past visits, your interlocutors in the region were not particularly ready to talk about that post-war structure. Where do things stand now?
So, Courtney, on hostages, as I said, we remain intensely focused on that. We're determined to do everything we can to get everyone home, to get them reunited with their families. Including pursuing the process that had worked for 7 days. We had 7 days of a pause, 7 days of people coming home and being reunited with their families. So we're on that almost hour by hour. But meanwhile, we've also been very clear that we support Israel and its efforts to make sure that October 7th never happens again. We've also been very clear about the imperative of doing that in a way that puts a premium on protecting civilians and making sure that humanitarian assistance gets to those who need it. So that's what we're focused on, and we're doing both at the same time. At the same time, and in the conversations that we had today, it is important for us to be talking about, thinking about every aspect of this challenge, not only today, but also what happens the day after the conflict in Gaza is over. How are we thinking about what happens in Gaza itself? How's it governed? Where does the security come from? How do we begin to rebuild? And critically, how we get on a path to a just and lasting peace. And for us, of course, that has to result in a state for the Palestinians. So all of that's on the agenda in our conversations.
The Gaza Health Ministry today is talking about more than 100 Gazans who've been killed. There seems to be some confusion. You mentioned the Israeli effort to articulate safe areas, but there seems to be some confusion in Gaza about where exactly those are. How would you assess the Israeli holding to the commitments they made to you yesterday to do a better job protecting civilians? And a second question, there's a New York Times report yesterday about an Israeli intelligence assessment that was floating around that appeared to more or less have the entire Hamas attack plan. Are you aware of that? Is the U.S. government aware of that report? And how has that affected the way you're using Israeli intelligence and assessments in your analyses? Thank you.
So, first, on the civilian protection and humanitarian assistance piece of this, as I said, that is absolutely imperative, and we saw Israel take steps immediately today to start to get information to people about where safe areas are, how they can get out of harm's way, and we're just talking about right now today, and I haven't had a chance to see exactly what happened today. I have seen that information start to get out. I saw the plans that Israel has in a multiplicity of ways to do everything possible to protect civilians, including making sure that they have the information they need and that there are ways to accommodate them. And this is going to be very important going forward, and it's something we're going to be looking at very closely. In terms of the report in the Times, on the Intelligence, look, there is going to be plenty of opportunity for a full accounting of what happened on October 7th, including looking back to see what happened, who knew what when, and Israel's been very clear about that. Right now, the focus is on making sure that they can do everything possible to ensure that it doesn't happen again, to make sure that civilians are protected, to make sure that humanitarian assistance gets in, and as I said, to also look at what happens once this conflict is over, what happens in Gaza, what happens more broadly in getting us on a path to lasting peace and security. So we're focused on all of that. I think there'll be time, and I know this will happen, there'll be accountability looking at what led up to October 7th.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken on the tarmac at the airport in Dubai. He just left Israel, and he's in Dubai for the UN Climate Summit. Times of Israel writes that Secretary Blinken warned Israel's war cabinet on Thursday that it likely doesn't have months to wage war against Hamas in Gaza, as domestic and international pressure mounts on U.S. President Joe Biden's administration to draw an end to the fighting, an Israeli official said. Back in the U.S., this from CNBC, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell on Friday pushed back on market expectations for aggressive interest rate cuts, calling it too early to declare victory over inflation. Despite a string of positive indicators recently regarding prices, the central bank leader said the Federal Open Market Committee plans on keeping policy restrictive until policymakers are convinced that inflation is heading solidly back to 2%. That was from CNBC. Chair Powell spoke at Spellman College in Atlanta.
The strong actions that we've taken have moved our policy rate up and well into restrictive territory, by which we mean that tight monetary policy is putting downward pressure on economic activity and inflation. Monetary policy is thought to affect economic conditions with a lag, and the full effects of our tightening likely have not yet been felt. The forcefulness of our response to inflation also helped maintain the Fed's hard-won credibility, ensuring that the public's expectations of future inflation remain well anchored. Having come so far and so quickly, the FOMC is moving carefully forward as the risks of under and over tightening are becoming more balanced. As the demand and supply-related effects of the pandemic continue to unwind, uncertainty about the outlook for the economy is unusually elevated. Like most forecasters, my colleagues and I anticipate that growth in spending and output will slow over the next year as the effects of the pandemic and the reopening fade and as restrictive monetary policy weighs on aggregate demand. The FOMC is strongly committed to bringing inflation down to 2% over time and to keeping policy restrictive until we are confident that inflation is on a path to that objective. It would be premature to conclude with confidence that we have achieved a sufficiently restrictive stance or to speculate on when policy might ease. We are prepared to tighten policy further if it becomes appropriate to do so. So we're making decisions meeting by meeting based on the totality of the incoming data and their implications for the outlook for economic activity and inflation, as well as the balance of risks. And that's an overview of what my colleagues and I at the Fed are working to accomplish. The bottom line, if you're a student, is that we've made considerable progress in reducing high inflation while maintaining a strong labor market, with a lot of opportunity for new graduates. The unemployment rate has moved up a bit, but it's still very low by historical standards, and by many measures, it's a great time to start your career.
The Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell at Spellman College in Atlanta. He later did a roundtable with technology innovators joined by Federal Reserve Board member Lisa Cook, a graduate of Spellman. And Spellman is an historically black women's liberal arts college. Lisa Cook is the first African-American woman and first woman of color to sit on the Fed board. Wall Street today, the Dow up 294, NASDAQ up 78, S&P up 26. The U.S. House of Representatives today passing a resolution to reverse a Consumer Financial Protection Bureau rule that requires financial institutions that make more than 100 small business loans per year to collect race, gender, and other demographic information of those applying for credit. The House vote was 221 to 202, 6 Democrats joining Republicans in voting yes. Congresswoman Young Kim, Republican of California, supported the resolution during debate on the House floor.
The rule is nearly 900 pages and requires lenders to report 81 data fields. If the CFPB's proposal is enacted, small financial institutions will be forced to devote more of their time to comply with burdensome regulations rather than focusing on providing loans for small business owners. With credit tightening for small businesses due to persistent inflation, higher interest rates, and an uncertain economic environment, the CFPB Section 1071 rule would impose higher costs for small businesses and lead to a decrease in lending to small, minority-owned, women-owned businesses. Earlier this year, the CFPB suffered a major data breach when an employee forwarded consumer information of more than 250,000 to a personal email account. So how can we trust the CFPB to properly manage the collection of additional data when it cannot efficiently safeguard existing data? So I would urge Director Chopra to go back to the drawing board on Section 1071 and issue a rule that gets it right without punishing small banks and small credit unions with higher compliance costs and burdensome requirements. I strongly urge my colleagues to support this resolution and access to credit for small businesses by voting in favor of this resolution. With that, I yield the balance of my time.
Congresswoman Young Kim, Republican from California, on the House floor. The reference to Section 1071 is from the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act of 2010, and it was the section in that law that led to this regulation. Congresswoman Joyce Beatty, Democrat from Ohio, spoke against today's resolution to overturn this Consumer Financial Protection Bureau rule.
The CFPB rule seeks to increase transparency in small business lending to increase competition, to lower borrowing costs for small businesses, to detect and deter lending discrimination, and create new lending opportunities, particularly for small businesses owned by women, by people of color, LGBTQ individuals, and rural business owners. This rulemaking is long overdue, as we've heard, by requiring lenders to provide information about loan applications, including whether they were approved or denied, as well as pricing data and applicant demographics. The rule will enhance accountability, which we talk about, and ensure the financial institutions are meeting the needs of the entire community. And wouldn't we want to know if we had a loan that was
yield
denied?
an additional minute to the gentlewoman from Ohio.
The gentlewoman can continue for 1 minute.
And I think it's very important. I can't imagine any one of us applying for a loan and getting it denied that would not call that lender and say, tell me why my loan was denied. And that is a part of this, Madam Speaker. And lastly, this transparency will not only benefit small businesses, but also family farms, financial institutions, and the economy overall. I strongly recommend that we support this and go back and reread the language.
Congresswoman Joyce Beatty, Democrat from Ohio, on the House floor. Again, the House passed this resolution that would reverse the CFPB rule. The vote was 221 to 202. The Senate passed the resolution last month, 53 to 44. So it goes to President Biden, but he says he will veto it. And the vote totals in the House and the Senate, if they stayed the same in a veto override attempt, would not reach the two-thirds necessary to override the veto. Today is World AIDS Day, and at hiv.gov, there's this. Every year on December 1st, the world unites to commemorate World AIDS Day. This annual event serves as a reminder of the global struggle to end HIV-related stigma, an opportunity to honor those we have lost, and a rallying cry to continue working toward a day when HIV is no longer a public health threat. In 2023, we mark the 35th commemoration of this important day with the theme World AIDS Day 35, Remember and Commit. That was from hiv.com. Congresswoman Maxine Waters, Democrat from California, spoke today at a forum on HIV and the politics of race, hosted by Johns Hopkins University Center for Health Disparities, and she talked about government funding.
We got to deal and we got to face these budget cuts that are being proposed by the Republicans. It is very unfortunate that the politics of race is not the only threat facing people living with and affected by HIV/AIDS today. The Republican majority in the House of Representatives is slashing the HIV/AIDS funding under a wide variety of federal programs. Their proposed Labor, Health, and Human Services, that is HHS, appropriations bill for fiscal year 2024 cuts $767 million from domestic HIV/AIDS programs in 1 year. It cuts funding for the Minority AIDS Initiative in the Office of the Secretary by 53% and completely eliminates funding for minority AIDS initiatives within SAMHSA. It also eliminates funding for the ending of the HIV epidemic initiative within the CBC, the Ryan White HIV/AIDS program, and the Community Health Program Centers program. The cuts to the Minority AIDS Initiative will exacerbate racial disparities, and the elimination of the ending of the HIV epidemic initiative could leave thousands of people without comprehensive care for HIV and tens of thousands of people without access to PrEP, which prevents infections. These programs used to have widespread support. It is shameful that House Republicans are now trying to eliminate all of them. We cannot allow these cuts of Congress to pass. We cannot compromise. We cannot give up. After all that we have accomplished, we must refuse to allow the politics of race to undermine the Minority AIDS Initiative. We must refuse to allow House Republicans to undermine HIV/AIDS programs throughout the federal government and risk the lives of millions of racial minorities and other Americans who are living with or at risk of HIV.
Congresswoman Maxine Waters, Democrat from California, today at a Johns Hopkins University program in Washington on AIDS and minority communities on this World AIDS Day. A story from thehill.com. House Republicans plan to hold a vote to formalize their impeachment inquiry into President Biden, with the matter coming before the Rules Committee within the next 2 weeks, the panel's chair told reporters after a closed-door meeting of the GOP conference. Republicans met twice this week to review their probes and the benefits of a formal vote on the inquiry. That was reporting from The Hill. The House Republicans were briefed by the chairs of the 3 committees in the inquiry. One of them, James Comer of the Oversight and Accountability Committee, stopped by and spoke with reporters.
Hi, Chairman. Can you give us another update? How were things received?
I don't think we could have been better received under any scenario. The conference is eager to proceed with this. They recognize the obstruction the White House has continued to put forward in our investigation. They want this investigation to continue. They were home for a week, and the people in their district say, we want answers to these questions.
You went in and said maybe a vote on the floor in a few weeks, but now we expect it next week. Is that true?
That's up to leadership.
What's the pitch that you made in there to members, some who might be on the
I didn't make a pitch. I said these are the facts. This is the evidence. We have the website up.
Why do you think formalizing the inquiry is necessary at this point?
Well, one of the letters from Abby Lowell implied this wasn't a legitimate impeachment inquiry because you hadn't had a vote on it.
And you're confident that you have the votes for it to pass?
Well, I'm confident our conference will want to get the truth for the American people.
Are you going to be whipping people, or is there going to be any kind of operation?
That's the whip's job.
Congressman James Comer, a Republican from Kentucky, chair of the Oversight and Accountability Committee, speaking to reporters outside the closed-door meeting of House Republicans this morning. Story from ABC News, the Washington, D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals issued a long-awaited ruling Friday determining that former President Donald Trump can be sued for allegedly inciting the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, rejecting his claims of absolute immunity. The court's ruling emphasized repeatedly that it only focuses on the singular issue of the former president's claim that he should be immune from any civil exposure because he was acting in his official capacity in the days leading up to and on January 6th. The decision will now allow members of Congress and officers of the Capitol Police to move forward with a series of lawsuits filed against Donald Trump that are seeking damages for harms they say they suffered as a result of the riot. That from ABC News. Washington Today continues in a moment.
People often think C-SPAN is funded by the federal government. In fact, we're a nonprofit organization that receives no government funding. As news consumption changes, you can help ensure the future of C-SPAN's unfiltered coverage of national government and politics. We hope you'll consider making a tax-deductible contribution that will support our daily editorial operations. To learn more, visit cspan.org/donate.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you find your podcasts. An article at The Hill about a Supreme Court case argued this week, SEC v. Jarkissi, reads, one of several attacks being waged by conservatives and business interests against the executive branch. The case could claw back the SEC's and other agencies' powers to enforce regulatory schemes. Joining us on the phone is the reporter that wrote that story, Zach Schoenfeld. Thanks for being with us. What is this case about, and how does it potentially fit into the larger issue of federal agency power?
Well, specifically, the case at hand arose after the SEC about a decade ago had began trying to enforce securities laws against conservative radio host George Jarkissi. Jarkissi had also, in addition to his radio show, had managed two hedge funds, and the SEC had alleged that he had misrepresented the fund's investment strategy, that he had claimed that a prominent firm was auditing the funds when in fact they weren't, and also had inflated asset values in order to increase management fees. So back in 2013, the SEC brought enforcement proceedings against Jarkissi using their in-house administrative law judges. Eventually, the administrative law judge went up to the commission, found that Jarkissi had to pay a fine and pay disgorgement for all of this. And then afterwards, Jarkissi began bringing the case into the federal courts, saying that the SEC system of using these in-house judges violated his constitutional rights. So that gets to where we are now at the Supreme Court, where they're reviewing the lower ruling that found that the SEC system on three different grounds was unconstitutional. So if the SEC was to lose on any three of these different arguments, it really would mark a huge clawback in the agency's ability to attempt to combat securities fraud.
When you listen to the oral argument, what did it tell you about which way the justices may rule?
Well, the argument really focused on one of those three constitutional grounds that were at issue in the lower court. It focused on whether or not Jarkissi's constitutional rights were violated, specifically his Seventh Amendment right to a jury trial. And we saw a number of the Supreme Court's conservatives expressing skepticism about the legality of the SEC system, saying that Jarkissi and others who go through these in-house judges and are forced to pay civil penalties, that violates their rights and that they are entitled to go before a jury of their peers. So we don't know exactly where the justices might fall on those other two grounds, but based on the oral arguments, it does seem that at least on this argument that the SEC probably is on the losing side of this whenever a decision comes down. And even if we don't see much in the opinion written about these two other arguments, just saying that this system violates the Seventh Amendment right to a jury trial would potentially not only affect just the SEC, but also could affect a number of other federal agencies that use these similar schemes of in-house administrative law judges to seek civil penalties.
We're talking with Zach Schoenfeld with The Hill. This Supreme Court has shown that it is willing to overturn precedents, but what are the Supreme Court precedents for this case and this issue?
So one of the main cases that has been cited on this argument of whether or not it violates jury trial rights is a case known as Atlas Roofing. It's a case that's about 50 years old. and had essentially established a carve-out for certain in-house proceedings, saying that those don't apply to the Seventh Amendment, that agencies can do this and use their in-house systems, don't have to worry about the constitutional protections of a jury trial right. But we saw from the justices at this argument, as they had talked about how since that precedent came down nearly 50 years ago, the SEC and the federal bureaucracy more broadly has really shifted, and it's grown substantially. And we saw a number of the conservatives just talking about how, as time has gone on, really expressing concerns about the size and the breadth of agencies like the SEC's ability to go and try to enforce these various regulatory schemes without ever having to go through an actual federal district court. At one point, Justice Neil Gorsuch, one of the court's conservatives, it just plainly said, this is not your grandfather's SEC. And as we said at the onset, this is one of a number of cases this term at the Supreme Court in which the conservatives are really taking on what has become known as the administrative state.
And before we let you go, Zach Schoenfeld with The Hill, we learned today that retired Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor has passed away. What is her legacy?
Sandra Day O'Connor was the first woman that was appointed to the Supreme Court, appointed by Ronald Reagan back in the 1980s. She served more than 2 decades on the bench and had really emerged as the indisputable swing vote on the court on issues like abortion. She wrote the majority opinion in one of the court's abortion precedents that was overturned last year. She wrote a majority opinion enabling affirmative action in college admissions. So really, although she was appointed by a Republican president before coming to Washington, had served in Arizona's government as a Republican, she really did at times emerge as an independent voice, siding with the court's liberal wing and becoming one of the most important and swing votes on the court. And in the years since, after she retired from the court back during the Bush presidency, she has spent most of her later life being an advocate for civics education.
Zach Schoenfeld, legal affairs and courts reporter for The Hill. Find his stories at thehill.com. Thank you very much.
Good to be with you.
Now, some of the oral argument in the case, SEC v. Jarcasi, argued Wednesday. Justice Neil Gorsuch questioning Brian Fletcher, attorney for the Securities and Exchange Commission.
Well, we'd agree that the right to trial by jury, whether it's criminal or civil, is a very important foundational freedom in American society and a check on all branches of government, wouldn't we?
We do.
Okay. And we'd agree that if the government sought the same penalties in a criminal proceeding, a jury trial right would attach.
I think that depends, Justice Gorsuch. I think on fines, this is a point that Atlas made. Actually, government can seek fines, and it doesn't trigger the Sixth Amendment jury trial
penalties.
right.
Penalties?
Criminal fines.
Criminal penalties, you think no jury trial right would attach? A felony, this is a felony fraud, and the guy can go to jail and he can get penalties. You think no jury?
I'm not saying that there's no limits on that. I'm just saying a point that the court made in Atlas was that for small fines, those
small
can go.
fines.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. But here we're not talking about a small fine.
Yeah. So, and again, I don't want to fight too much on this. I agree.
So
we'd agree required in a criminal case. Yes.
If this were a criminal case, it would have a jury, right?
I think that's I don't know, honestly, where the line would fall, but I'm not going to disagree that criminal cases involve juries, and if this were civilly brought in a court, it would require a jury. I concede that as well.
And, well, let's come to that in a second. So, returning to the Chief Justice's questions about administrative regimes, I've got another one for you. Let's say the government revived the Sedition Act and decided that, it's really important to have a federal agency who could bring penalties for defamation against the government. Jury trial? No jury trial?
Unconstitutional on First Amendment grounds.
Forget about the First Amendment. Too easy. We're talking about the Seventh Amendment and the right to a jury trial, and that is an important and ancient right, too.
Yeah. And what I'm saying, and the reason I responded to that, I realize that's not the point of the question, but I think the intuitive force...
Then let's answer the question.
Yeah, so if it's a
Seventh Amendment right or no Seventh Amendment?
Otherwise valid federal regulatory statute being enforced by the government pursuant to its sovereign powers, that's Atlas roofing in this case. Lots of other constitutional problems.
No jury trial right. I think that has to be the implication of your argument.
Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch questioning Brian Fletcher, an attorney for the Securities and Exchange Commission, in the case SEC v. Jarcasi. The lawyer for George Jarcasi, Michael McCulloch, also focused on the right to trial by jury as he opened his oral argument.
Congress has steadily expanded the SEC's authority over the past several decades
And now, like a house that's been added onto too many times, it's crushing the original foundation. For the Seventh Amendment, that foundation was set in 1791. The founders thought that they had enshrined this right for government claims against citizens' property rights, still stinging from the Stamp Act and the abuses of the Vice Admiralty courts. My friend's really radical position is antithetical, totally antithetical to the founders' intent. The jury trial right should apply especially when the government is coming after a citizen for penalties on a common law claim. The SEC's position really fares no better under the public rights doctrine. The basic claims, these basic fraud claims, are litigated privately among private parties every day, same claims, same statutes, and they've been litigated, the same basic claims have been litigated for centuries. These underlying claims do not suddenly morph into public rights claims just because the government happens to stand in as the proxy plaintiff.
Michael McCulloch, attorney for George Jarchese. You can find the full audio of the oral argument in the Supreme Court case SEC v. Jarchese, heard Wednesday, at our website, cspan.org. Some reaction coming in to the news that retired Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor has passed away at the age of 93. She was on the court 1981 to 2006. She has been out of the public eye since announcing in 2018 that she had been diagnosed with dementia. Current Chief Justice John Roberts putting out a statement. A daughter of the American Southwest, Sandra Day O'Connor blazed an historic trail as our nation's first female justice. She met that challenge with undaunted determination, indisputable ability, and engaging candor. We at the Supreme Court mourn the loss of a beloved colleague, a fiercely independent defender of the rule of law, and an eloquent advocate for civics education. And former President Barack Obama writes, as a judge and Arizona legislator, a cancer survivor, and a child of the Texas plains, Sandra Day O'Connor was like the pilgrim in the poem she sometimes quoted, forging a new path and building a bridge behind her for all young women to follow. In 2002, C-SPAN interviewed then Justice O'Connor about her book, Lazy Bee, Growing Up on a Cattle Ranch in the American Southwest.
You were a private law practitioner out in Phoenix.
Yes.
You were in the state senate there,
Yes.
majority leader at one point.
Yes.
You were a Superior Court judge?
Yes, and assistant attorney general at one time.
Attorney General.
And I was on the trial court bench and then the Court of Appeals.
And here for 21 years.
Yes.
What do you think of this job?
Oh, it's such an interesting job, of course. Think how privileged we are to serve here and to have the most interesting legal issues of our times come to this court. And to work with a group of colleagues who are so dedicated and intelligent and competent, and everybody on this court wants to try to do a good job, and they work hard at it. It's really wonderful. You know, when I was in the state senate, like in any legislative body, there are times when somebody will say to you, well, I'll support your bill if you'll support me on mine. I think you call that vote trading. There isn't any of that here at this institution. And that's just wonderful. It's a place where everybody sincerely tries to do the best job he or she can with the issue before them and give it their best shot, and you're not trading for anybody else's view.
Sandra Day O'Connor in 2002 on C-SPAN's Book Notes program. She was confirmed as a Supreme Court Justice in 1981, retired in 2006, and died today at the age of 93. More tributes from former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Democrat from California. Today, America mourns the loss of Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, a trailblazing public servant, an icon for working mothers, and an inspiration to women across the country and around the world. Her passing is a tremendous loss for our nation. And from Senator Chuck Grassley, Republican from Iowa, Justice O'Connor was the first Supreme Court nominee I had the honor of voting for as a senator. She was a trailblazer for the High Court and actively worked to drive consensus. Her contributions to the court will endure, and she will be missed. The Arizona Republic newspaper reports funeral service plans and tributes for the late Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor were not immediately available Friday, but her brother previously indicated she wanted to be cremated with her remains left at the family's ranch in Arizona. The 101st annual National Christmas Tree Lighting Ceremony took place Thursday night on the Ellipse south of the White House, place known as President's Park. President Joe Biden and First Lady Jill Biden did the honors.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, you got it.
Merry Christmas,
Merry Christmas, everybody.
This year's national Christmas tree is a 40-foot Norway spruce from a West Virginia national forest. President Biden spoke to the audience about the holiday season.
This is a great tradition. One, as has been pointed out already, we've honored over 100 years, where presidents and the people come together to usher in the holiday season. Earlier this week, Jill announced the theme of this year's holiday at the White House: magic, wonder, and joy. 3 words that capture the essence of Christmas and the holidays. To rediscover for ourselves the simple joys of the season, from familiar songs to favorite recipes. To open the hearts with simple acts of kindness, especially to those going through hard times. And to strengthen the bonds with family and friends, as well as with our faith and our community. To remember, we're a great nation because we're a good people. That's what I see all across America, including tonight.
President Biden and First Lady Jill Biden Thursday night at the lighting of the National Christmas Tree. From the National Park Service website, from December 2nd through January 1st, everyone is invited to visit the National Christmas Tree and enjoy this annual holiday tradition in our nation's capital. They also write, the beloved tradition of the National Christmas Tree lighting ceremony began Christmas Eve in 1923, when President Calvin Coolidge lit a 48-foot balsam fir from Vermont decorated with 2,500 red, white, and green electric bulbs. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word and get the stories making news in Washington emailed to you every day. Subscribe at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night and weekend.